So notice you have Enoch, Talmud, Basil, and then if you fast forward to the 1800s, you have scholars that are translating and commentating on the early church writings, also realizing, whoa, this sounds very similar to, say, present-day Darwinism. But what's really curious is that the verse says, "Let the waters teem with these nephesh, these soulish creatures, and also generate birds." Anyone who knows about evolution knows that birds come originally from fish, ultimately. And now, what's interesting is that before Jesus comes on the scene, you have Second Temple texts like, say, the Book of Enoch, saying, like in other words, you have Jews doing a pesher on these texts. And even the Talmud, which is about a century or two after Jesus, saying that the oceans generate feathered birds, specifically using the word for feathered. How interesting, right? And then the Talmud says, Rabbi so-and-so said this, Rabbi so-and-so said that. Oh, and by the way, isn't it interesting that bird feet look like they have scales like on a fish when they're commenting on Genesis 1:20? So they're, in other words, they're connecting birds and fish. In regards to the Talmud, here's on verse 20. So in Talmudic literature, you'll have like point number 1, right? And then point number 2, then point number 3. So it's like the first thing is like, oh, look, cattle were created out of the dry ground, right? Then fish were created out of water, Then fowls were created out of marshy ground. They may therefore be used for food by one side. Okay, it's like, okay, it's a bit ambiguous. And then a rabbi comes in and is like, well, actually, observe, and proof of this last fact that fowls have scales on their legs similar to those of fish. And then another engagement is like, well, yeah, because doesn't it say, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature and fowl? But at the same time, in chapter 2, it says, out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and fowl. So how can these passages be reconciled? And then again, it must be marshy ground, both water and But the point is, here you have even Talmudic scholars going, there's something interesting going on here, and how they make this connection that fowls and fish. How about the Book of Enoch? So here's, I'll just type in feathered, because Charles Worth is the guy who did the translation. Okay, Thursday, with respect to the 5th day, right? I commanded the sea to engender fishes and feathered birds. All right? It just says it point blank. One of my favorite, though, absolute favorite, is Basil the Great. So, Basil says, let the waters, it is said, bring forth abundantly moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly. So why do the waters give birth also to birds? Because there is, so to say, this is like Darwin writing, a family link between the creatures that fly and those that swim. So then he tries to assume how they can be related in this like as if they are of the same family, right? So he's making now a scientific assumption, which is wrong, by the way. But notice he's still attempting one. So he's like, look, in the same way that fish cut the waters, using their fins to carry them forward and their tails to direct their movements and so on, right? So we see birds float in the air by the help of their wings. Okay, so that's his attempted scientific answer. It's wrong, but, kudos for trying, right? But then the next bit, his conclusion, is still scientifically accurate. Both endowed with the property of swimming, right? Their common derivation, literally common descent from the waters, has made them of one family. Now, footnote 3. Here is, now remember when Hughes said in the 1600s, scholars were engaging the stuff in the 1600s. The translator, which is this guy. So when you look at the date of this translation, this is done by Philip Schaff, 1895. All right. So Philip Schaff quotes from this French scholar. If you can read French, that's the scholar speaking about verse 20 in the same way as Basil said it. Guess when this guy lived? In the 1600s. So even in the 1600s, they're thinking in these evolutionary terms. And then Philip Schaff goes, oh, and by the way, because he's living post-Darwin, right? The theory of evolution is, as is well known, that birds developed out of reptiles and reptiles out of fish. Check Haeckel's monophyletic pedigree in his history of creation. Haeckel was a massive Darwinian defender and also an anthropologist and all that. Paleontologist. And by the way, let me also just quickly say this. In that same passage, just before he reaches verse 20, here's a time in Christian history where Christians, and in this case the patristics, they start to remove themselves from the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So in other words, Basil says it's foolish to think of the sky as a solar dome. So, and that's fine. Like it's interesting to see the more advancement of a type of like cosmological view, right, leading up until Copernicus in the 1500s. But coming back to the 300s, Basil says, why do the waters give birth also to birds? And then he goes into this notion of, well, it air. And believe it or not, they had a sophistication of air similar to modern physics. Classical mechanics, that air is like a fluid, and hence if you take a course known as fluid mechanics, sure enough, for example, why do planes fly? Because again, if you treat air like a fluid, lift and drag, it works the same way. And water is just a more denser fluid. So Basil's like, well, it seems like the birds swim, just like the fish swim. Because see, birds have like fins that, they flap, and so then, fish may be, flapping in the water, so to speak, right? But then he says something very interesting. He's like, well, in that case, they must be of one family. They must derive from each other. He literally says common derivation of, the birds and the fish. That is in a Darwinian sense, that's common descent. And one family is like a monophyletic, what's known as a monophyletic pedigree. There's something, okay, wait. This is gonna make you trip. It's trippy. This is the other quote I was thinking of. My bad. Now this is before Basil. Basil is in the 300s AD. This is the guy in the 100s AD, in the 2nd century, Hippolytus. He says this. He quotes, he's a Christian quoting from Anaximander. Okay, Anaximander was a pre-Jesus Greek philosopher, like the 2nd or 3rd century BC period. Look at this. And that man was originally similar to a different animal, that is, a fish. This is by Hippolytus, the first great Christian father whose history is Roman, is nevertheless not a Roman but a Greek. But anyway, but the point is, he lived in the 170s to 236 AD period, and he's quoting from, in light of the fact that Anaximander, which is that philosopher, and so people at the time pre-Jesus, but at the same time, had run-ins with Hellenistic Jewish culture, right? So in other words, he would have been familiar with Genesis 1, making up all these theories. And here's a recounting of that one particular theory, that we originally were from the oceans. So notice you have in writing, in Christian writing, um, a lot of it is wrong science, because again, we're dealing with science at the time. But you just come across little statements like this, which just, it's like, dude, you're right on the money. So, okay, I'll just zoom in because then you can be able to read it. But this is Origen. Let the waters bring forth creeping creatures having life and birds. So then notice he goes, according to the letter, creeping creatures and birds are brought forth by the waters at the command of God. And we, notice this language, recognize by whom these things which we see have been made. So he's like, yeah, I agree. Somehow the birds have some sort of relationship ultimately from the waters. But then comes Origen's allegorizing. It's like, yep, okay, that's already a given. But let us see how also these same things come to be in our firmament of heaven, that is, in the firmness of our mind or heart. Notice how he now starts to allegorize firmament of heaven because firm means firmness of heaven. So he's thinking of heaven as the mind or heart, and the firmness, and then he goes into allegorizing big time. But the point is, he doesn't deny the natural fact in this paragraph over here. So that's Origen. So notice you have Enoch, Talmud, Basil, and then if you fast forward to the 1800s, you have scholars that are translating and commentating on the early church writings, also realizing, whoa, this sounds very similar to, say, present-day Darwinism. Now, my final point on this is, what about in the middle? Someone like Calvin and Luther. So on the fifth day, the birds and fishes are created, and he's like, it seems, however, but little consonant with reason. In other words, it's illogical that he declares birds to have proceeded from the waters, and therefore this is seized upon by captious men as an occasion of calamity. But although there should appear no other reason but that it so pleased God, would it not be becoming in us to acquiesce in his judgment? Stop judging what God decided to do, is what he's saying. And so why should it not be lawful for him who created the world out of nothing to bring forth the birds out of water? And what great absurdity, I pray, has the origin of birds from the water than that of light from darkness? So therefore let those who so arrogantly assail their Creator look for the judge who shall reduce them to nothing. Okay? So Calvin's like, be patient. Now I find Calvin's comment very interesting. Both acknowledge this. They both are saying, yep, it seems like birds come from the waters. But Calvin's one is very interesting because Calvin goes, there are atheists in my day making a mockery of this verse. Because, yeah, it is insane. How the heck do flying objects derive from the ocean? I'm just going to leave it up to God, because in his wisdom, he did it this way. And then he goes into, like a typical, like, what we do today with apologetics, he makes an excuse, right? Because, see, the resurrection is paradoxical. I can't explain the resurrection, the mechanics of how that works. And I can't explain how, like, the ex nihilo thing, like, in other words, God of the gaps. God did it. He chose to do it. I can't explain it, but he did it anyway. That was Calvin's approach in his commentary on that verse. But the point is, how interesting. Like, if Calvin were to live, like if Calvin was writing in the 1800s, he would react the same way with Philip Schaff. But they didn't have modern science, to like back them up, so to speak. So they're just sort of like, I can't explain this. It is what it is.